Topic is from plantation to prison, and we're talking to the chairperson of the Criminal Justice Department at Tennessee State University, Dr. DBurris-Kitchen. And of course, Dr. DBurris-Kitchen, let's see if we can pick up where we left off the last time, because I think that you were giving us some excellent information relative to how African-American males, in a real sense, were made criminals, and it was to the advantage of a large number of economic groups that happened. Let's pick it up at that instance.
Okay, once I was just going through Reconstruction real quickly. Now I'd like to just kind of move on to the late 1800s and the decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, which at this point made all southern states made it legal to make it separate but equal as far as education system, and also just legal segregation, period. And a lot of African Americans fled to the north to escape, this oppressive, segregated system, but found when they got to the north that things were, the job market was not opened up to them, and they came in as opposed to labor union workers, they came in as labor union busters. And if they didn't want to find, or if they didn't find a job, not that they didn't want to, if they couldn't find a job right away in the north, they were criminalized as well. Because they were trying to find a job, and then if they couldn't find one, had no money, of course, they got involved in some maybe illegal activity that was not really harmful to other people, but we like to call them victimless crimes in criminology, so that they could make a little money because the job market wasn't open to them in the north like was promised to them when they moved to the north. But in the south, those that stayed in the south, segregation was a very real system that let them know as a slap in your face the racial hierarchy exists in this country, and if you don't abide by the racial hierarchy, that you will be criminalized and you will be punished. And the Ku Klux Klan was in full force at that time, terrorizing African Americans. He tried to get a quality education. He tried to integrate the workforce, or tried to integrate schools, or tried to do anything that was against this racial hierarchy that was constructed through Plessy versus Ferguson. You could be criminalized again for very minor offenses, and a lot of African Americans were criminalized for minor offenses, especially in the Jim Crow segregated South. The image of African Americans as you've got to force them to work because they're lazy and they don't want to work on their own was still in existence at that point too, as well as the African American was a dangerous person who, and then at this point drugs came into play. We really didn't worry about the war on drugs up until the early 1900s, and then in 1937 the Marijuana Tax Act came into place, and then our government was worried about people using cocaine and poppy seeds and all kinds of stuff, but they really focused on the marijuana use of African Americans and cocaine use of African American males, and criminalized a huge population of them for that as well, and the speakeasies and things like clubs and things that these drugs were being used in, and gambling, and so those types of crimes really only African Americans were criminalized for. The interesting thing about the Jim Crow era that's kind of different about the era now and convict leasing and slavery before it is actually the incarceration rates matched the arrest rates. Although the arrest rates were higher than their average population. They were about 30% starting when we collected data. But that's what their incarceration rates were. But through slavery and convict leasing, their arrest rates were always, or their conviction rates and their incarceration rates were always a lot higher than the crimes that they were allegedly out there committing. But during this point, even though they focused on we're going to arrest a lot of African Americans, their crime rates and their incarceration rates kind of matched. It wasn't really until Brown versus the Board of Education passed, and then the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the civil rights legislation that came out of those movements in the 60s, that we saw a huge change. And it's almost like when we moved from slavery to Reconstruction. After 1965, blacks began to make a lot of progress again, economically, politically, socially, in education, and it wasn't but, let me think, 65 to about 72. 72 is when the war on drugs really took place. So it's almost like it was a planned attempt to assault the progress of the African American community, because it took, I mean, because the progress was happening so quickly after the civil rights legislation took place, as far as entrance into colleges and universities, quality schools starting to emerge for African Americans, and education again being the key to the ending of the oppression and exploitation of people of color in this country. And it's like, okay, now we've got this war on drugs. And the war on drugs has moved the prison population of African Americans from being about 300,000, about what it was during the convict leasing period, but there were more African Americans in the 70s. So, but in the 70s period, there were more African American in 1970s. So they were really not, it was really not a huge population of people who were incarcerated. We're talking overall the prison population about 500,000, and they probably made up maybe 100,000 of that population. And then about the middle of the war on drugs in the 80s, that population of African Americans just skyrocketed. The general prison population skyrocketed, period, from about 500,000 in the 80s to about, well, we're at 2.5, over 2.5 million right now just in prison. And out of that 2.5 million just in prison right now, over 1.5 million are people of color, whether it's blacks and Latinos. They didn't even count Latinos as people of color until about the, I think it was the mid-90s on the Bureau of Justice Statistics. They threw them in white. So really the image of people of color being overrepresented in the prison system is distorted, because you know, if you throw Hispanics in with African Americans and include all people of color, you're talking about 70% of the prison population that's in there for nonviolent drug offenses are people of color. And if you look at the federal level, it's like 85%.
Now, would you say that